Morning, everyone. It's very difficult to start speaking after a pharmacologist being from an industry, because basically we are doing part of that job in the companies. I'm the Global Pediatric Medical Director belonging to the Pfizer Pediatric Center of Excellence, and I'm here today just to, very briefly, in a few minutes, try to tell you what an industry usually does to put on the market, to create more than put on the market a new drug. And I'm going to use a parallel. You know, we are used to the family, that mom and dad are taking care of the little baby. They are, of course, generating, then is delivered, then it goes to the kindergarten, then to the primary school, then to the secondary school, then is finally graduated. Basically, what an industry does is the same. If we want to say what is an industry, industry is the mom and dad of the drug. We are doing, it's quite a broad family, many members, many roles, but the main concept is that we are mom and dad of all the drugs. And of course, being in England and with many colleagues from Liverpool, I can't avoid to quote Beatles. And so this is the long and winding road of the life of a new drug. It's from the little baby, the little neonate, when an idea comes to a group of people within a company, and they try to elaborate something that can become a drug. It's not a drug, it's still a molecule, it's still an idea. Then the toddler starts the real life of the drug and goes through many stages, the formulation development, the first proof that it's something this molecule is doing, and when it is grown enough in terms of knowledge, in terms of data, the baby, the child goes to the school. Is of course the primary school, and we start the clinical development, and progressively our daughter, our son, is growing, is becoming an adolescent, is going to the end of the clinical development, and then the final stage, the graduation. It's a drug, and it's a registered drug. This is the life of a drug, and this is what the company does to accompany the little baby, the little molecule, to become what it will become, a drug. So, as I said, unfortunately, the mortality of the drug is very high. We have seen it before, and we are speaking about more or less 1 out of 1,000 molecules will become a drug. And this is an important thing because, of course, it's going to have an impact on the cost of the production of a new drug, of the creation of a new drug. You have seen this chart already plenty of times. I think you are bored. But just to tell you that, just to continue the parallel with the family, after the child has become an adult, I mean, has reached the legal age, you know, he goes out from the house, the parent house, but the parents still are vigilant on what the son and the daughter are doing in their life. And this is exactly what we are doing. And of course, being vigilant about a drug, it can be translated into pharmacovigilance. And this is exactly the way how the parents, the industries are continuing checking the life of the drug. Whatever becomes a new reporting of adverse event, we have just listened it, can be a signal that something is going wrong and the company must intervene, must do something. this is an aspect that is, I think, very poorly known. How a drug is created. I mean, from where the drug comes. I mean, if we want, this is the kind of the delivery room in a pharmaceutical company. The drugs are basically done from an idea of a group of scientists who on the computer create a molecule, shape a molecule, a chemical structure. And then they test this molecule against millions and millions of potential targets that are proteins, and these proteins can be, I don't know, on the surface of the cell, so they are a receptor, or they can be enzymes, so they are participating in some particular mechanism that regulate the cells, or can be, I don't know, in a structure that is devoted to the production of new proteins. Think about some antibiotics work like this. And basically we have this big robot, these huge, these are buildings that are able to in an automated way, to put together the new molecule with a million of targets. This system that is called high throughput screening allow all the companies to test millions of drugs every day, millions of molecules against millions of receptors every day. And thanks to this system, among millions and millions, billions of reactions, in a certain moment, a light is on. It means that a molecule has combined with a target. We don't know what does it mean at all. But we know that something is happening. And so we start thinking about it. And the next step is to take the molecule and to see what is the molecule, what it's doing. And basically think that at that stage, we just know that they interact. So we start thinking, can they better interact? They can better bind, because, for example, the binding is very weak. And so we start playing a bit on the molecule. This is an example, a real example of a molecule that was started in our company. In the beginning was just what we call a tetracycline structure. Tetracycline comes from the Greek, it's 4 rings structure. And then we played a bit adding pieces to this structure until we reached, after 20 attempts, we finally got a structure that then we discovered was a perfect antibiotic. And so that is a drug that was created, starting from an idea, then a weak reaction, then adjusting a bit the molecule to make it more useful for the purpose we want. Then, of course, we have to start. Let's say that it's not yet a drug. It's still a little toddler. We want to grow and to become a child. And we start working on the animal model. The animal model is mandated by some regulations, by guidelines. We need to test on an animal what wouldn't be ethical to test on a person, of course. And especially if we think to drug for children, we must be sure before whatever attempt on the real people that is really not toxic and is somehow producing some effect. And so in the animal, usually starting from the smaller one, then as far as you have more data, you can go on the biggest animal. And we start looking about the effect of this new molecule into tissue, into organs. Then we try to see if there are already some effects, adverse effects that may compromise the future use of the molecule. So on the skin, on the eyes, of course, we need to see if there's an impact on the genes, on the chromosome. We need to know if there's this type of interaction, and we need also to know that it is not generating cancer. Of course, on the animals, we have not the guarantee that this will be sure on the human, but at least we have a starting point. And then we need to start think if this molecule that has an effect that binds a target that is not toxic, or at least is acceptable, the toxicity, if it's a suitable candidate to become a drug. But to become a drug, we need to know that this new molecule is absorbed. So it really has the possibility to enter in the body of a human being. We are not at this stage, still at the human being stage. We are doing on the animal, but we are trying to predict what will happen in the human. Then after the drug, the new molecule has been absorbed, we want to know the distribution, where the drug goes, which are the organ, if it is limited, if it is to more organ, multiple organ. Then we want to know how it is, let's say, how it is used. So we go to see how the body breaks this molecule in what is called the metabolism, and of course the excretion. We want to know where, how much, in which form the new molecule is get out from the body. I know that you hate the acronyms, but this is called ADME, ADME. And so when you will see this acronym, you know that these are the four, let's say, destiny, the four things that we want to know when a drug comes into the body. But now the question is it a drug? Because so far we can just again say that, yes, it's reacting, it's not toxic, it's entering in a body. At the stage is an animal, it's metabolized, is excreted. But here there are the three pillars of the pharmacology. Basically, to be a drug, a molecule should arrive to the target site. I mean, think about a drug that we think can target the liver for whatever disease, but if the drug is not able to arrive to the liver, it's useless. So we need to know, if the drugs arrive to the site. Then, once it's on site, is it binding the target really? Because that was just something that we have seen in the very beginning, but now we need to confirm. And once this binding has occurred, is happening something? Because it can just bind, and that's it. We don't know. We need to know if this binding has an effect. And these are the three questions that we need to answer to say, yes, this is a drug. And in fact, when we start the process of the clinical development, we have the target to answer to these questions. We need to prove the mechanism. And the proof of mechanism is exactly what we have just said, the three pillars of the pharmacology. But we need also to see if the reaction that is generated by the binding of the new molecule with the target creates the effect that we want. It should not be a negative effect. It must be something that is addressing a problem that we are targeting. And this is the proof of mechanism. Then it's the proof of concept. The proof of concept is that we are going to show that it is a real effect, and it's an effect that reached the target we had in our mind. So it's effective enough to treat or to, in some way, modify a certain process, a certain disease. And finally, we have the proof of principle. And this is something that is done later when we are sure that the drug is safe enough, is producing an effect, but then we need to statistically show that this effect is it's enough for become a real drug to go on the market. And here we start also seeing the efficacy, because so far we have basically seen the safety of this drug. Now, as I said in the beginning, we are a family, and the industry is the mom and dad for the drug. Of course, we all know that the mom and dad and grandfather, grandmother are not enough. Usually we need the broader family. All other members of the family used to grow up the children, and this means that the industry can't do everything alone. And so we have to rely on the help of other colleagues. And other colleagues in this case are the so-called contract research organization. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker and colleague, Cindy Jackson. Here.
Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I do have to say that I'm a little bit intimidated because I listened to yesterday afternoon's talks, and you guys are really hard to follow. So thank you for allowing me to come and talk just very briefly today. I know that I am the second to the last speaker between you and your break, so I will be really brief. I have the pleasure of leading the Rare Disease and Pediatrics group at a large contract research organization called Covance. We're headquartered in the United States, but we have offices all over the world. So I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about CROs. And CROs are often called contract research organizations, or also clinical research organizations. And basically we have all the pieces and parts that you would have if you were in a pharmaceutical company, except we don't do the drug discovery and we don't have the drugs. So as Claudio so eloquently stated, the pharmaceutical companies entrust their children to us to try to get the data that we've been talking about today in a format that those drugs can then be used in humans and approved by regulatory agencies. So there are hundreds of CROs that are based all over the world. They range in everything from companies that have greater than 50,000 employees to companies that have a few hundred. Some of these companies are global in nature and they have offices all over the world, and some are very regionally focused and will focus on Asia or Eastern Europe and have operations only in those countries. Some CROs focus on a specific segment of the pharmaceutical industry, so they'll only do phase 1 trials, or they'll do trials that are later phase, or they'll do the gamut, which is a company that I work in. We work in all phases of clinical trials. Some companies have specialized groups that focus on pediatric clinical research, and I'm fortunate to be at a company that does that. And there are also several of my colleague companies that are here today that also have specialized groups who focus on pediatric clinical trials. And I'd like to be able to tell you that we're the folks in our organizations that champion children. And we champion clinical research. And we try to make sure that when things come in the door in our organizations, that first they make sense. So some companies are very good at doing clinical research geared toward children, and some have never done it before. And so in those cases, we have to step in and provide that expertise to those companies to help them get their clinical trials done so that they can fulfill regulatory obligations for their pharmaceutical companies. In other cases, the pharmaceutical companies are very adept at doing pediatric clinical research, and in that way, we work hand in hand with them to make sure that, again, we can do what we can within the operations of our groups to make sure that we get the trials done to the satisfaction of both the sponsor and the regulatory agencies. So most CROs have a variety of different pieces and parts. So they start with project management. So those people that run the protocols, they keep the finances going, they make sure people are where they're supposed to be. The clinical monitors who go to your physician sites to make sure that the data the physicians are collecting makes sense, is in good order, because the last thing we want to do at the end of the day is have a clinical trial for which children participate in that we don't have good data. Because at the end of the day, the drug will never get approved if we don't have appropriate data. We also have groups that do pharmacovigilance, and you heard a little bit about adverse drug events. We want to make sure that we collect that information. We have physicians who work in our companies, and those physicians will work hand in hand with your physicians who are enrolling patients in clinical trials to make sure that you are, in fact, an appropriate participant in a clinical trial, that you fit the criteria, and should you have any issues or problems during the trial, that your doctor or your investigator has someone to talk to who represents the pharmaceutical company. We also do site identification, patient recruitment and engagement, and that means we have to find the right places to find patients to enroll in the clinical trials. We have to make sure that those investigators who are enrolling patients are appropriate, who know what they're doing, and who follow worldwide standards for doing these clinical trials. So again, everything a pharmaceutical company has, except for drug discovery and the drugs, most CROs cover. You've seen this graphic many times, so we're not going to go through it, but I'm just going to talk about the green part, the phase 1 through the phase 3 clinical trials. So from our standpoint in the CRO, what's involved with developing and completing clinical trials? So really it starts with patients and families. So we need to have patients and families involved in the clinical research from the beginning to the end to make sure it's meaningful. We have the sponsors that Claudio has talked about who discover the drugs. We have the regulatory agencies who approve the drugs at the end, and Angeliki, after me, is going to talk a little bit about that. And then you have the CROs who provide assistance to sponsors with everything from the very beginning to the very end. From early clinical development, some pharmaceutical companies don't have their own toxicology departments and don't have those preclinical services. CROs do. We might help with protocol development and protocol writing. I'm currently working with a pharmaceutical company now where we're looking for the feasibility for doing a program in chronic kidney disease in children. We help with regulatory submissions, manage the clinical trial sites, help the clinical trial investigators with questions regarding those protocols, because as you can imagine, it's very complicated. So I like to tell people who work with me that our patients in a clinical trial is the protocol. We have to make sure the protocol is followed so that the right people are entered at the right time, the right data is collected so that we can put it all together at the end of the day and deliver it to the pharmaceutical company to make sure the regulatory agencies have what they need. So how does a clinical trial in pediatric patients get done, and how do CROs help? So it's all about thinking, planning, and strategizing. So the first, when we see a protocol that comes into our organization, even before we start working on it, we look at it and we say, does this make sense? Can we do this? Is this really appropriate for pediatric populations? Because again, sometimes pharmaceutical companies have never done a clinical trial in a pediatric population before. So we may be the first ones in the CRO who looks at the trial from a pediatric standpoint and said, can we even do this? Is 12 blood draws in 24 hours appropriate? Probably not. So we'd have the courage, I hope, to go back to the pharmaceutical company and say, can we talk about this? Is there something that we can do to mitigate this really a lot of blood draws? We also look at how many times blood is drawn, how much blood is drawn, because there are guidelines to dictate what is appropriate and what is not. And then also sometimes when we get a protocol, again, sometimes from companies who have not done a lot of pediatric research, the first question I always ask is, how big is the pill? How is it given to the patients? And does it taste good or does it taste terrible? How big is the pill? Can a child of 4 swallow this particular pill size? And again, we would then go back to the sponsor and say, we need to talk about how we can solve these problems. Then we have to find patients and investigators. And I just mentioned that I'm working with a company now about finding patients and investigators in a really hard area in chronic kidney disease in children. And where are they in the world? And what stage of disease are they in? And what is the standard of care in the countries of the doctors that I'm talking to? Just this week, I've talked to investigators in Lithuania, in Turkey, and in the UK. And as you can imagine, how things are done are altered across those geographic regions. And why that's important in a clinical trial, let me give you a very quick example. I was involved in a trial in which the drug was an injectable. So you gave it in a syringe attached to a pump, attached to IV tubing that then went through an IV. So that all makes perfect sense, except the pumps in different regions are all different. So, okay, we'll give everybody the same pump. Well, that was fine, except for not all the tubing is the same size in all the countries. So then we had to make sure that all the sites had the right size tubing with the right pump to make sure we delivered the drug appropriately. These are all some of the problems that we mitigate in the CRO industry. We also sometimes have to worry about, do sites have freezers? Can they store blood samples? Can they store the vaccine that's going to be tested? So we also make sure that those things are done on the site level. And that's even before we start initiating sites and enrolling patients. And that's when it gets interesting too. We have to make sure the drugs get to the sites on time with the right amount of placebo or different doses in different packaging. And we have to make sure the packaging is easy to understand, especially if there are different doses that are being used in the clinical trial. And then finally, one of the things that we work on very closely, and I've worked with iCAN on, is the Ascent process. So all of you have to assent if you're going to be participants in a clinical trial, and you have to understand what's going to happen with you. But sometimes we, as adults, don't get how to talk to you as young people. So it's really helpful for us to talk to you about what we should be writing in these assents and what makes sense to you and what we can do to make sure that it's useful and beneficial so that you understand what you're participating in. Also, one study I was involved in involved going to Native American reservations in the United States. So we went through all the usual channels, but one thing that we had to do is we had to talk to the tribal elders in those communities to make them aware of what the trial was that was being held in their geographic regions so that they could understand what was happening. So we also have to understand social norms and customs, and so it's very useful for us to have people who work in our organizations in those geographic regions so they understand those social customs and norms. So again, at the bottom line, most contract or clinical research organizations have participated in the development of almost every drug that's on the market in one way or another. It may be a very, very small piece of the puzzle, but it may be the entire development program. It might be 3 or 4 or 5 studies. But it really is we're part, as Claudia so nicely put it, of the family of drug developers. So you may never have heard of us, but we're around, and we're generally the people that are monitoring the studies and managing the studies for our pharmaceutical partners. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angeliki, because a really important part is to make sure we get the data and the information available to our regulatory agencies so that they can go forward and develop and approve drugs for children.
Right. I'm the last person of this group, so I try to speak quickly and still make sense, which is not often the case. So my name is Angelica Siopkara. I work for an organization that not many of you might have heard of, and it's an acronym. It's called MHRA. It is Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulating Agency. Basically, we are the FDA of the UK, and that's how people kind of know what I'm doing when they ask me, what do you do these days? I lead the pediatric team I was a pediatric bone doctor about 10, 11 years ago, and I joined the agency as a career break. 11 years down the line, it's not a career break. I can live with that now. I'm a regulator, so you met one now. So I'm here to introduce what we do to that baby when it comes to us, because we are, if you like, the gatekeepers before they go and be adults and be out there. But we don't stop then. I'll speak a little bit about it. Who are we? We are a range of individuals. Quite commonly I say that it's nice to work in an organization that has more women than men, compared to my orthopedic training, which I was the only girl around boys. As I said, I'm a doctor by training, and there's a lot of colleagues of mine that they are doctors, but there is a range of expertise that we need in order to assess what comes to us, in order to review it and answer questions and let that baby go to the world. There are pharmacists, there are scientists ranging from statisticians all the way to biologists, animal people, experts who know what the animal data shows. Because we need to tell people what we do, we have a press office and communication experts. We also have lawyers, people like inspectors that go out, IT clever people like data, which I don't know anything about it. And that's me throwing all my documents to the ground because I had enough that day, but I'm usually much nicer than that. So these are bullet points from my agency website. So what do? We basically review medicines and devices as well. I know we've been talking a lot about drugs, but there is also things that we use for our health that they are devices. For example, patches that we put on our skin to get the drug delivered. So we regulate that, we monitor them to make sure that they're safe and made in a very high quality way, and also they work. But it's not me as a person making that decision. We have set standards, either through guidelines or legislation, that tell us what the standard is, and everything is tested against those standards. But we also look at other things, and that's very important for people to remember, because that's why I'm here and I'm speaking to people like yourselves and getting feedback and listening, actually, because we want to make sure that the supply chain is safe and secure, that you, as a patient, you go to a pharmacy and you pick up your box and it's there when you need it. We help educate the public, the patients, the parents, the carers, but also the healthcare professionals. And I use that term not to exclude anybody, from the doctor, the nurse, the midwife, the pharmacist, everybody that works in health, about the risks and benefit of medicines and devices. And that makes their use much more safe and effective, and support innovation and research, and develop those guidelines to protect public health. And I think that's important. As a doctor, you look after one patient. As a regulator, you look after the health of a lot of people, the health of the public. Oops. This is my IT challenged self. Push on. All right. Good. Sorry, got it there. Don't tell my stepchildren. So, what do we do? And I'm only going to focus in a couple of activities, because what the range of things we do is, what do we do to get that baby out in the big world? We have to give it a license. That's the exams, if you like, in order for you to pass from child into adulthood and be out there. So the company, through the help of the research network, as you said, or the CROs that done the trials, come to us and say, listen, we've got this amazing new drug. It's brilliant. It works really well, and it has not very many side effects. Here's the data. That was the papers you saw on the floor, but it's also on the computer as well. So, not that we don't trust the companies or we don't trust the data that have come out of the clinical trial, but we just want to check to make sure everything is done properly. So people like myself, called assessors, sit down in front of a computer, in front of papers for a very, very long time and see all the evidence and the data from multiple sources, trying to answer one very simple question. Well, it's not very simple, but it's one question. Is the benefit for the patient versus the risk of a side effect acceptable? So if we say to that patient, take this drug, that patient can be sure that it's likely that it will work and do what's meant to do and do it properly and not give them horrible side effect as much as possible. And I'm not going to talk much about the benefit risk because Dan did it in brilliant work, but this is what we assess all the way. And it's sort of one is a little bit more risky, but the disease is really horrible, so we can accept this, or the other way around, as you say, for a common cold. But it's important to say that it works as it's supposed to. And you heard about the drug that Dan mentioned, and I was an orthopedic surgeon by then, Vioxx, and it was brilliant and it was working for me, but it was doing something somewhere else that it wasn't right, and that was the side effect. We also look at how it's made. So when it gets into that tablet, is it done properly? What else is in that tablet? Because the medicines not only contain the bit that we need for our disease, it contains other things to make it a tablet, otherwise it wouldn't be. We call those excipients. If it's a liquid, it got something that it calls flavoring, just to make it taste like strawberry or bubblegum, apparently. It's a common flavor. I don't like that one. I have tasted a few medicines, yes. And how easy for patients to give. So there's no point of a drug to say, yeah, it works, it's brilliant, but if you give it to a toddler, within 30 seconds they spit it out because it tastes horrible. So is it easy for patients to have? But again, as I said, we don't do it on our own because I'm not a patient. I'm not dealing with that disease. So we make sure that we ask patients and their families about what they think about their disease, what their needs are, and a little bit of what they think about the drug. And we also ask experts, clinicians, colleagues, pharmacists out there that they deal with the patient. So we ask their opinion in order to make a decision. And we don't work on our own, because these are important questions. We have committees that make these decisions at the end. So me as an assessor go into this committee where other people like myself from other countries sit around and say, this is what we think. I think it's a good thing. The benefit to risk is possible. The drug gets licensed and it's available and used by parents. And you've seen by Dan the patient information leaflet that we all read when we get a medicine. I hope so. Maybe not always, but let's try to do that. Because it tells exactly who, when, and how to use the drug. And we have to be transparent. So all the information about how we do and how we make decisions is in the public domain. But that's not where the story ends. And you heard it, this funny term of pharmacovigilance. I raised my hand when I said I submitted an adverse drug reaction, a yellow card report. I was having a problem, and I was taking a medication that my doctor has given me, and I was developing alopecia, which basically means I was losing bits of my hair. And despite the fact I was working in MHRA and yellow card is part of what I do, I didn't understand that alopecia was related to the drug I was taking. I thought it was because I was maybe a little bit stressed at that time and my hair was falling off. It took me a while to connect the fact, hang on a minute, I'm on this new drug and my hair is falling off. And I filled up a yellow card and I spoke to my doctor, and the doctor said, you know what, it's a common side effect, but not usually in girls. We see it in boys, but thanks for telling us, and they swapped me to do medicine. So they knew that that drug was causing alopecia, was causing baldness in the hair, but for boys, not for girls. So the fact that I put in an information like that and people would look at it and say, now the box says it can cause alopecia to both boys and girls. So we need to monitor the drugs and make sure that we change things. And as I said, we changed the information and said, if you're a boy or a girl, be careful. But we need to keep on telling people that as you've heard, will evaporate, it causes harm, and we need to communicate. A final point, and this is my last slide, is children are special. You are very special in this room, no doubt about it. But the drugs don't act in the same way in children and adults. So when I joined the agency, a piece of legislation came into force to actually promote and help companies, clinicians, researchers, and everybody to work together to agree to a plan, a PEP, we call it PEP, a plan that will lead to medicines getting licensed in children, and that's a big part of the work I do. So thank you very much, and I hope I haven't bored you to death.